Welcome to Estonian Real Podcast. My name is Matti and my today's guest is William B. Grant, who is a director of Sunlight Nutrition and Health Research Center, an entity devoted to research, education, and advocacy relating to the prevention of chronic diseases through change in diet and lifestyle. He received his Ph.D. in physics from UC Berkeley in 1971. For the last 18 years, he has been studying the effects of vitamin D on human health. Author or co-author of over 60 articles in the peer-reviewed journals, edited 2 books of reprints, and contributed half a dozen chapters to other books. So Dr. William, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
So, Dr. William, why you start studying vitamin D?
Okay, yes, why I started studying vitamin D. My introduction to health research began around 1996. At that point, I was working for NASA Langley Research Center in Virginia, East Coast United States, and studying the effect of acid rain and ozone on eastern hardwood forests. And during that period, I learned how to do what are called ecological studies, where populations are defined geographically. And you look at health outcomes and health risk factors and do statistical correlations. And then when I was on a trip with NASA Langley to New Zealand, I read that Japanese American men in Hawaii had 2.5 times as much Alzheimer's disease as native Japanese. Now, I'd been studying Alzheimer's disease because my mother had Alzheimer's, and I realized that people with Alzheimer's had more aluminum in their brains. And I also learned from studying the acid rain on the hardwood forests that trees picked up more aluminum with acid rain because acid rain dissolved the oxides of aluminum and transition metal ions, leached out calcium, magnesium, and so the trees picked up the wrong trace minerals and started to go in decline. And so I said to myself, well, this finding in Hawaii is probably linked to the American diet. I mean, nothing else could explain how Japanese American men in Hawaii had much more Alzheimer's than native Japanese. So then I did an ecological study involving 10 countries and found that total caloric supply, total fat, were highly correlated with risk of Alzheimer's, and having ocean fish in the diet in Northern Europe reduced the risk a little bit, and having mainly a rice-based diet like in Japan, India, and China greatly reduced the risk of Alzheimer's. So I published this and got a national TV news in July 1997. And then 2 years later, I found the new book on cancer mortality rates. And this book has some very interesting pictures showing that many types of cancer were much stronger in the Northeast than in the Southwest. So the red in the Northeast is high rates of cancer, colon cancer mortality rates, and blue in the Southwest, South and Southwest is low rates. And at first, I tried to explain that based on dietary factors, but I quickly realized that we eat pretty much the same food countrywide. So I had to go back to a paper by Cedric and Frank Garland from 1980 and subsequent papers showing that solar UVB through production of vitamin D reduced the risk of cancer mortality rates. And I worked on that. I got the data for solar UVB from NASA and did correlations in between the mortality rates and UVB, and found that about 15 types of cancer had mortality rates inversely correlated with solar UVB. And as Cedric Frank Garland said, the primary physiological effect of UV radiation on the human body is production of vitamin D. So that led to a very important paper published in 2002 showing that UVB was inversely correlated with 15 types of cancer, and then a follow-up paper in 2006 showing that if I included other factors like alcohol consumption, smoking, urban-rural residents, poverty, and Hispanic heritage, the UVB effect was still there. It was not seriously affected by that. So this was much more interesting to me than my atmospheric studies for NASA. And so as soon as I turned 62, I retired and moved to San Francisco to pursue health studies full time.
Okay, then what? I understand at some point you started the Sunlight Research Center, but before that, what happened?
Well, I was publishing a few papers, and as long as I was working at NASA, there was no point in having a nonprofit organization. But when I moved to California, I formed the Sunlight Nutrition Health Research Center. Website is sunarc.org, and started having some support from the indoor tanning industry and the vitamin companies, and continued promoting UV exposure and vitamin D, and continuing to do research. I joined forces with the Vitamin D Council under John Cannell. I joined with Carol Bagley in grassrootshealth.net. And those are two vitamin D advocacy organizations in California. And I just continue working full time on mainly UVB and vitamin D, with occasional papers on the effects of diet on risk of disease. And my goal was to try to help people understand how to prevent chronic diseases and infectious diseases through natural means, through diet and through vitamin D and sunlight, as opposed to the American way of treating health, which is mainly to wait till people get sick and then treat them with drugs, surgery, chemistry, whatever. So I was trying to make things, make people live better.
But why this? You say that you do through natural means, but you say that you sound like modern medicine don't want to prevent diseases, they more like want to add more. And but why is that?
Well, there's a lot of money to be made in treating diseases. Cancer, maybe $100,000, $50,000 to $100,000. Heart disease, $100,000, $200,000 for bypass surgery. Vitamin D costs the United States maybe $10 a year for an adequate supply. And Big Pharma is really would like to make money. So they've adopted a way of doing business in putting down things like vitamin D, called it using the disinformation playbook. So what they do is they try to attack and undermine the best researchers on vitamin D. They try to publish papers that are not very useful, not very correct about vitamin D. They then have managed to take control of our health agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and National Institutes of Health. There's sort of revolving door between Big Pharma and those organizations. They then fund universities, the mass media, etc., to support Big Pharma and to not support things like vitamin D. And I outlined this in 2018, and now with COVID, it's becoming even more clear that this is what they're doing in terms of ivermectin. Ivermectin is a very inexpensive antibiotic compound that is used throughout Africa and some of South America for preventing and treating malaria. But it's also been found, it got the Nobel Prize in 1995, but it costs pennies, and Big Pharma wanted to make money on vaccines and expensive treatments. So they've suppressed, they've ridiculed ivermectin, they've suppressed any publication about it in the mass media, and because now they control FDA and CDC and NIH, they can get away with it. So it's really exposed how Big Pharma operates to maintain their way of life and their profit and their income.
But if like Big Pharma main goal is to make profit, that is there like some doctors who like disagree with this like kind of approach just to make turn in humans like into like money-making machine.
Yeah, there are a number of physicians who don't agree with this approach, but they're in the United States. They're pretty much now they are limited to what they can say, and if they oppose too strongly, they lose their position in hospitals. They may lose their medical license. In California, they can still say something on the internet, but they can't tell patients um, what they think about vaccines and ivermectin and vitamin D.
Okay, so pretty much it's like either do what we say or you lose a license to cure people.
They have a
Okay,
lot of control.
so that kind of I explain. I have a conversation with my friend as well, and then he like had conversation with doctors, and they said, okay, want to kill people, and it's everything okay, and but same time understand that the author will be silent, otherwise they lose license. But let's talk about more about this vitamin D. So what is vitamin D, and how many vitamin D we have?
Okay, so vitamin D is a compound. It's made from a type of cholesterol in the skin called 7-dehydrocholesterol. UVB, the shortest UV wavelengths, around 290 to 315 nanometer, hit this and they start a reaction, which then has followed by a thermal reaction, and then it becomes vitamin D. It goes into the blood, and when it gets to the liver, it receives a hydroxyl group and becomes 25 hydroxy vitamin D. So now this is the circulating metabolite of vitamin D. The original vitamin D is quickly converted to this 25 hydroxy vitamin D. Now in the kidney, this is converted to 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, which is the hormonal version of a metabolite of vitamin D. And in the blood, it helps regulate calcium and phosphorus absorption and metabolism. So there's a trade-off between there's parathyroid hormone and this 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, and they sort of balance each other in order to if one goes up, the other goes down, in order to keep serum calcium levels nearly constant. If your serum calcium levels get too high or too low, you can have very adverse effects on the body. But it turns out that, okay, there are two ways that vitamin D acts in the body. One is through affecting calcium and phosphorus, but the other way is through genetics. And what happens is that almost every cell in the body has a vitamin D receptor. And when this 125 dihydroxy vitamin D enters this vitamin D receptor, it can affect the expression of hundreds to thousands of genes. It upregulates or turns on many, it downregulates or turns off others. And it turns out that the organs that need this genetic effect will have a mechanism whereby an enzyme where they can convert the circulating 25 hydroxy vitamin D to 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, so it can then enter the vitamin D receptors. It was thought for a while that you could just give people 125 dihydroxy vitamin D, but that doesn't work. It raises calcium too much. But the organs are really smart. They know when they need it, and they then say, okay, let's make this compound and let's do this. And it's been an interesting paper was published in 2019 showing that when they gave people 400, 4,000, or 10,000 international units of vitamin D per day for 6 months, those were given 400 IU per day, maybe had 120 genes affected. Those given 4,000 had maybe 600 genes affected, and those given 10,000 had maybe over 1,000 genes affected. Unfortunately, I think this goes back to Big Pharma. The Institute of Medicine made recommendations for vitamin D dose and concentrations back in 2010 in the United States, and most countries have sort of adopted that. And what they said was that, well, at that point, all we knew about the benefits of vitamin D was that it was for bone health. preventing fractures and falls and that sort of thing, and osteoporosis. And so what they said was, okay, you need at least 20 nanograms or 50 nanomoles per liter of serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D for bone health. And that would only take 600 IU per day if you're under the age of 70, or 800 IU per day if you're over the age of 70. And that's been the recommendation. It turns out that the study on cancer, like I pointed out, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, depression, diabetes, et cetera, cardiovascular disease, these did not really get started until early this century, starting after maybe 2002, 2004. And it's only in the last 5 or 10 years that the evidence has become strong enough that we realize that vitamin D has beneficial effects in a causal manner for all these types of diseases, and that you need more than 20 nanograms or 50 nanomoles per liter for optimal health. For cancer, it's been shown that you get benefits up to 50 or 60 nanograms per milliliter. For cardiovascular disease, certainly above 30 or 75 nanomoles per liter. But there's no movement to try to get the NIH, National Institutes of Health, to re-examine these recommendations. So as a result, many people are unaware of the need for higher vitamin D intake and levels. And doctors, unfortunately, get very little training in vitamin D. They're trained in drugs. They're very good at finding drugs to treat diseases. And like I say, they don't. The other thing is that, and part of this disinformation playbook approach, the 3 major medical journals in the world, that's the Lancet, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the New England Journal of Medicine, have in the last 10 years or so only published papers on vitamin D if vitamin D did not work well. Before that period, they used to, in fact, Michael Holick has one of the highest cited vitamin D papers published in the New England Journal of Medicine 2007, over 10,000 citations. He outlines all the physiology, what was going on. But now they will only publish things like the VITAL study, the big $30 to $40 million vitamin D supplementation study out of Harvard that gave people 2,000 IU per day. Well, it turns out the average vitamin D level among the participants who even gave their vitamin D levels, was above about 75 nanomoles per liter. And 2,000 IU per day, that's 1/10 of what one can make in the sun on a good day in the summer. So started with high values of vitamin D, gave them low amounts of vitamin D, and then they analyzed it only in terms of, did we give them vitamin D or did we not give them vitamin D? That's called intention to treat. Every person starts with a different value of vitamin D level. Every person has a different achieved value of vitamin D. And so without analyzing them in terms of their own personal change in vitamin D, they missed a lot. But they did find out that people with body mass index less than 25 kilograms per meter squared did have a 25% reduction in all cancer incidence. And they found that African Americans who had around a 20, they had maybe a 25 nanograms per liter vitamin D level, they had also about a 25% reduction in all cancer incidence. For the entire group, there was a reduction in all cancer mortality rate, but New England Journal of Medicine only put one finding in the abstract, and that was the only finding that was discussed in the mass media, which is vitamin D didn't have any effect on cancer, cardiovascular disease. Well, for cardiovascular disease, they should have enrolled people with below 25 nanomoles per liter instead of averaging 75 nanomoles per liter. So most doctors who read just those 3 journals and don't go to the secondary journal literature, the the non-mainstream journal literature, they're unaware that vitamin D has a lot of effects, a lot of benefits, and they're not encouraged to find this out.
Okay, but if I'm like a regular person who wants to know more about vitamin D and research, what things I should look out in order to get real information?
There's two good websites now on vitamin D that I like. One is called vitamindwiki.com. It's run by Henry Lahore, who's a retired Boeing aeronautics engineer in Washington State, and he spends 10 hours a day sucking in all the vitamin D literature, analyzing it, posting it in an organized fashion on his website so that people have a topic like cancer or cardiovascular disease or pregnancy. They can start going in there, they can find the papers, they can find the graphs, they can find the references, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's one good website. The second good website is grassrootshealth.net. That's an organization started by Carol Baggerly in around 2007, 2008. At that time, she was a breast cancer treatment survivor. She'd gone through mastectomy, radiation, and chemotherapy, hated all of it. And then after that, she went to see her general practitioner who said, you have osteoporosis or osteopenia. You need to start taking vitamin D. And being a good researcher, she'd been a businesswoman who did a lot of research in dealing with the company she dealt with. She found out that the Garland brothers had pointed out that vitamin D could have reduced her risk of breast cancer. And Garlands were not, they were both in Southern California, and she eventually hooked up with Cedric Garland and brought him as part of the group. But she's made it her mission to try to educate people about the benefits of vitamin D and now magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, et cetera, et cetera. And she has a testing program where people can in and get a blood spot test kit. They can draw 4 spots of blood on a card, send it back, and find out what their vitamin D level is. And the same for omega-3 and a few other things. But she has a Twitter account, grassrootshealth.net, has a daily posting. They have a daily email that comes out. So I would recommend people interested in sort of the lay approach to, well, it's well reasoned, but try to explain it to the general public what's going on. Grassrootshealth.net would be a good source too. The third one I like very much is scholar.google.com. Now this is where you can find almost all the papers published in science. And you can go in there and put in like vitamin D and cardiovascular disease. It will show you the papers generally ordered by how important they were, how many citations they've gotten. And it'll also show you where to get the full paper. If you go to pubmed.gov, which is run by the National Institutes of Health in the United States, you will find some full text versions, but often the journals want to charge for the papers, and it's rather not pay. So if you go to scholar.google.com, you can find the papers and probably download them for free. Now, it may be that the abstract is all you really want to read, but if you need more details, they would be in the full paper.
So the real data is available, just you need to look for it correctly. Okay, Sunlight Institute, one of the goal is to reduce chronic diseases. I understand that in your point of view, chronic diseases can be prevented, can be cured. But from my understanding, based on mainstream medicine, is that it cannot be cured. If you have chronic disease, you have chronic disease. That's it. But can you explain how chronic diseases can be cured?
Sunlight, I was going to say that cardiovascular disease rates vary by about 25% between summer and winter. In summer, you have a lot of solar UVB, and in winter, you do not. And what happens in winter is that the vitamin D levels are maintained at about 50 to 70% of the summertime values by taking 25-hydroxyvitamin D out of the muscles and recirculating it in the vascular system. So this shows that vitamin D can have a direct effect on adverse effects of chronic disease. There was a study on diabetes, a clinical trial in which people with prediabetes were given 4,000 IU per day, and it was found that if they raised their 25-hydroxyvitamin D, for every 25 nanomoles per liter they raised their 25-hydroxyvitamin D, they reduced their progression from prediabetes to diabetes by 25%. So this is, and then in cancer, vitamin D has 3 ways that it reduces the risk of cancer mortality rate. First of all, it reduces the incidence of cancer by looking at the cells in the body and asking whether the cell should be promoted, left to proliferate, or should be killed, should be commit suicide, apoptosis. But since there are a lot of other mechanisms that affect cancer incidence, smoking, toxins, being obese, et cetera, et cetera. But then what vitamin D can do, it can, in order for a tumor to grow, it has to develop a vascular system around it to bring it the nutrients. So vitamin D can reduce the production of this vascular system around the tumor. And then in order to really kill somebody, the tumor has to metastasize into the rest of the body. And again, vitamin D has mechanisms to reduce the risk of metastasis. They are finding now that giving vitamin D to cancer patients will help prolong their life. It may not fully cure it. On the other hand, very high dose vitamin D has been found to put multiple sclerosis into remission, to put psoriasis back. I mean, when you get to treating disease, you often have to use much higher doses than you need for preventing. And there's not enough research on the high dose vitamin D for treatment yet.
How big doses we talking about? Like 5,000, 10,000, 20,000?
Okay, so I take 5,000 international units of vitamin D per day, and at that, my vitamin D level was up to about 150 nanomoles per liter. And according to Grassroots Health and my own research, the optimal range for vitamin D is probably around this 40 to 60 nanograms or 100 to 150 nanomoles per liter. I tried taking 10,000 IU per day and got up to around 270 nanomoles per liter, which is probably a little bit high. I didn't get any adverse effects, but it's a little questionable whether it's useful to be that high. So now I weigh 135 pounds, which would be about 62 kilograms. And the heavier people are, the more vitamin D they need. For one thing, the more fat mass one has, the more systemic inflammation one has. And one of the things that vitamin D does is it reduces inflammation. So if you have more inflammation from being obese, you've just got to take much more vitamin D to overcome that. So there's a lot of literature now suggesting that people not have their vitamin D levels measured, saying it's not cost effective to measure vitamin D. I would agree with that to a point. I would say that most people would be better off by just taking, say, 4,000, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 IU per day of vitamin D, especially in the winter. But if the doctors and the patients want to find out, do some fine tuning, then measuring vitamin D levels would be useful.
Estonian Medical Center's official guidelines say that you need to take 1,000 international units per day, but if you take 2,000 or more, then it will become toxic. So the question is, okay, is it like true, or and which point vitamin D becomes toxic?
There's a very interesting case in the United States around 2008, 2009. A Ph.D. who had published many books on nutrition and health and was selling a powder, finally told his manufacturer, okay, put 1,000 IU per day into this powder. Well, 1,000, there was confusion between the units of micrograms and milligrams. 40 IU of vitamin D per microgram. So it's a very, very tiny amount of vitamin D, but the manufacturer put enough to make 1,000,000 IU per day in a scoop. So what happened? After about a month of taking this 1,000,000 IU per day, maybe it was 2 weeks, I don't know, it wasn't very long, he started getting bloody feet. He couldn't think straight. He had to stop giving lectures and so on. And then Michael Hollick was called in. So Michael Hollick had his blood level of vitamin D measured and had the powder measured. He found out that it was 1,000,000 IU per day, and that his 25-hydroxyvitamin D was up to around 950 nanograms per milliliter over 2,000 nanomoles per liter. He stopped taking the powder and did some other things to help remove the vitamin D from his body. When his vitamin D level got down around 400 nanograms per milliliter, about 1,000 nanomoles per liter, what he had was hypercalcemia. He had too much calcium in his blood, and that was causing all his problems. So once he got below that number of 400 or 1,000, the hypercalcemia went away, and he was in more or less good health. So the general rule is that you're not going to see hypercalcemia below about 150 nanograms per milliliter or 425, 450 nanomoles per liter. The Institute of Medicine back in 2010 was concerned about, they said that the upper limit should be 4,000 IU per day because they had not found any adverse effects below 10,000 IU per day, and just trying to be safe. Well, it turns out that there are a number of observational studies in which, if you look at the outcome as a function of vitamin D level, your outcome improves to a point, maybe around 75 nanomoles per liter or to 100 nanomoles per liter, and then it starts rising up again. And what I've suggested is that in those observational studies, what was happening was they were enrolling people in the study who'd only, with the higher values, had only recently started taking vitamin D and were therefore in the wrong category because they had years of no vitamin D intake and were developing cancer, cardiovascular disease, or something else. That may or may not be true, but the values they set for the limit were still too low.
So you talked about there's like preventing diseases but not curing them. So can you a little bit explain what is the difference between those two?
Well, like cancer, I point out, to prevent it, you want to try to prevent the tumor from starting to form. Once you've got a tumor forming, you require different mechanisms in order to overcome it. Cardiovascular disease. One of the big risk factors for cardiovascular disease is insulin resistance, and there's inflammation, and I guess free radical production. So by having reasonable levels of vitamin D above 30 or 40 nanograms per milliliter, you can reduce the inflammation, you reduce the risk of insulin resistance, you can reduce the risk of diabetes, and so you don't get going on to the path of getting a heart attack or a stroke. So once you have a heart attack or a stroke, you've reached the point where you have a lot of serious damage to your organs, and it's just a little difficult to deal with those. I think they're starting to use vitamin D, like I say, in cancer in a sort of a adjunctive fashion, using it along with whatever else they're doing, chemistry or chemotherapy or radiation or whatever. But now there's a doctor in Brazil who treats multiple sclerosis patients with 50,000 IU of vitamin D per day. But he also draws blood frequently, makes other measurements, and various other things that he's using to treat. So it's not just something that somebody with multiple sclerosis can start taking 50,000 IU per day and hope to overcome multiple sclerosis.
So, like, if you said that vitamin D is like very good to preventing lots of the diseases what we have, but how it's we go in the Middle East where it's like sunlight every day all year round. That does like Middle Easterns and Africans have like very good vitamin D levels, or they're like very bad and need supplements to prevent diseases?
So I've been writing papers on that recently, giving a talk last week. The problem in the Middle East is several-fold. First of all, their diet is mainly a plant-based diet, and it's only animal products that have vitamin D. So a study in England showed that the whites who ate meat had 20 nanomoles per liter higher 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels than the vegans who didn't eat any animal products whatsoever. So that's a sizable difference. So that explains maybe a good part of the why it's lower in the Middle East. Second thing is both the men and the women wear concealing clothes. Men wear white robes, women maybe black robes or something, but they are protecting their body from the sun and from being seen. The third thing is it gets very hot in the summer in the Middle East, and people would rather stay indoors with air conditioning rather than be outside in the immense heat. They don't fortify food in the Middle East. They could easily fortify the grain products, the dairy products, etc. There's people in the Middle East do not understand the benefits of vitamin D that well. The doctors don't understand it very well. The public doesn't understand it, and so people don't realize that they should be out getting vitamin D either from supplements or from the sun. And I'm trying to work with people in the Middle East to try to convince them that they need to get more vitamin D, probably from supplements and fortified food.
Okay, but how is it going so far? Is it like any progress, or is it like too early to tell?
I think there's rising interest in vitamin D. There are papers coming out of Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, about the benefits of vitamin D and how the levels among the population are low. I think it would probably take the government to start some programs such as fortifying food or making public service announcements or directing doctors to be more interested in it. But they do have conferences on vitamin D every year, and I've attended several of those and result in several papers published. But things take a while to sort of go through the population. It's interesting that Finland started fortifying food in a big way maybe 10 years ago. And it turns out through fortification and supplementation, vitamin D levels have risen. I don't think they have the evidence yet to say whether it's been enough to reduce disease rates. And that's what we're waiting to find out.
But is there any studies made in Africa to see like how is vitamin D effect in African population?
Yeah, there are some. I'm not very familiar with the literature, but there are some from Nigeria and some from South Africa. I've done a number of studies on African Americans and vitamin D, and they have, whereas the average white American has 26 nanograms per milliliter, the average black has 16 nanograms per milliliter. and the African Americans have much higher disease rates than whites do. And we're trying to make the case that by raising their vitamin D levels, they would reduce their disease rates. And indeed, studies like there's a stroke study, a study of vitamin D and stroke from the United States that showed that blacks and whites had the same relationship between vitamin D and stroke risk. Uh, uh, so blacks and whites were the same. Also, there's some very interesting work on pregnancy going on in South Carolina by Carol Wagner and Bruce Hollis at the Medical University of South Carolina. And they did an important study where they gave pregnant women free vitamin D and told them how they could raise their vitamin D level to around 40 nanograms per milliliter or 100 nanomoles per liter. And they wanted to look at the effect on preterm birth. Well, of course, some of the women supplemented and some of the women did not supplement. And they found that there was maybe a 60% increased risk of preterm delivery for women who stayed below about 20 nanograms per milliliter compared to those who went above 40 nanograms per milliliter. And it turned out there was no difference between Hispanics, blacks, Asians, or whites in that. So the vitamin D effect appears to be independent, pretty much independent of ethnicity or race. It's not so much independent of obesity, because obesity is throwing this extra thing, is putting more inflammation, which is harder for vitamin D to overcome. And there are studies showing that the indigenous rural Africans have concentrations above around 40, 45 nanograms per milliliter. So if they're out there in the sun all day, even clothed, they can raise their levels. But so much of Africa now is with people living indoors and eating processed foods. So they're getting away from their usual lifestyle.
You said that the most you get a good amount of vitamin D from meat-based diet. But why is there no vitamin D in a plant-based diet?
There are two types of vitamin D, vitamin D3 and vitamin D2. So to make vitamin D3, you need cholesterol, and cholesterol is only made by animals. Now, the fungi and the yeast have another compound that's like cholesterol, and when it's UV irradiated, like you UV irradiate mushrooms and yeast, you make what's called D2, vitamin D2. Now, it sort of acts like vitamin D3, but its half-life in the body is about half as long, and it doesn't have all the benefits of vitamin D3. It's not been shown to be as effective in reducing the risk of disease. However, in the United States, a lot of doctors prescribe vitamin D2 because they can get it from their pharmacy. They can, even though it's much more expensive, it's patented, it's more expensive than vitamin D3. They can just say, "Oh, here's a prescription. Your health insurance will pay for it. Just go get it from the pharmacy." And it turns out that in the northern third of the country, there's quite a few people taking vitamin D3 or D2, probably because their physicians have recommended it. But so it's just different source material, different chemistry in terms of plants and animals. And fish turns out also have ocean fish, oily fish, have a good source of vitamin D3.
But is it like a difference between if you take synthetic and natural vitamin D2? Because I read that if you take synthetic vitamin D2, that will neutralize effects of vitamin D3. Is it true?
Yeah, to some extent, I think that is true. It does start to reduce the amount of D3 in the body. And there was a meta-analysis of vitamin D intake and all-cause mortality rate published several years ago. And it showed there was a few percent reduction in all-cause mortality rate for taking small doses of vitamin D3, but an increase in mortality rate for taking vitamin D2. So I would recommend against taking vitamin D2.
So pretty much if you like physician recommend D2 supplements is more likely because it gets money from it.
And I don't think they've been educated about the difference between the two. Doctors don't get much education on vitamin D.
But is it also the main issue with doctors that they don't have a proper education about nutrition? Because one friend of mine is studied nutrition and said that all the answers is like right there, but for my understanding that doctors don't have this like knowledge about nutrition, or it's like very basic or no education at all.
Like I say, they like to treat rather than prevent. COVID is an interesting situation. I wrote the first paper saying that vitamin D could reduce the risk of COVID, and it's got hundreds of thousands of citations by now, about 1,800 citations. And I think vitamin D has some benefit in reducing and treating COVID, but it's not all you need. I mean, it helps strengthen the immune system, but so does zinc, magnesium, omega-3, and even though I had high vitamin D levels 3 weeks ago, I still got Omicron, the recent version of COVID, but it was a mild case. It only lasted a few days, and only had a sore throat and a little bit of fever. Let's look at cancer, for example. I looked up the mortality rates for cancer in Estonia for 2016, and it turns out that men have 212 deaths from cancer per 100,000 people per year in 2016, whereas women only have 103. But when you go to lung cancer, men have 53 deaths per 100,000 per year, and women have only 11 per 100,000 per year. So this means that, and also if you look at cardiovascular disease or ischemic heart disease or coronary heart disease, men have 218 deaths per 100,000 per year. Women have 122 deaths per 100,000 per year. So what I think is happening there in Estonia is that men smoke a lot more than women do, and so they have higher chronic disease rates and higher mortality rates. And so men are the ones who would benefit more by taking higher dose of vitamin D than women, because women already have a much lower mortality rates and much longer life expectancy. Is it generally agreed in Estonia that women live longer than men?
Yes, I think it's everywhere, because it's also, I think that it's mostly to do with what kind of job men and women prefer. Most, if you look at the statistic, that most men take like very physical intense dangerous jobs compared to women who take more like less dangerous job, and they're also mostly indoors.
Mm-hmm. Well, but these diseases are not linked to jobs. On the other hand, I did do a study in 5 Nordic countries looking at occupation and cancer rates, and it turned out that the outdoor occupations, such as farmers, gardeners, construction workers, maybe fishermen, had the lowest cancer incidence rates, whereas your indoor workers had much higher rates, especially if they were, say, a waiter or at a bar or a tobacco shop or something like that. So it showed that sunlight and occupation did sort of correlate. Even lung cancer was a little bit linked to occupation.
But okay, let's talk about a little bit cancer, because what for my understanding about cancer is that it's a rapid growth. The cells start growing rapidly and uncontrollably. But I also heard that the like link between cancer and fungus. And can you like explain that, is it like true, or there's like still theories about how cancer forms on when it starts?
What's interesting about the cancer growth rate is that men you're supposed to check for colon cancer every 10 years, but you're supposed to check for breast cancer every 1 or 2 years with mammography. And also it turns out that breast cancer is most frequently diagnosed in spring and fall globally. So in the summertime, vitamin D can reduce the growth of breast cancer. And in the wintertime, the hypothesis was that melatonin could reduce the growth of breast cancer. And it turns out that blind women have less breast cancer than sighted women. So it turns out if you do a long-term study, if you enroll people in what's called a cohort, and you draw the blood and say follow them for 10 years, you will find that colon cancer rates, well, they do decrease. The longer you follow up, the less effectiveness of vitamin D. But if you do breast cancer, if you go beyond 3 years, you generally don't find an effect. And that's because breast cancer can sort of sit below, be not undetectable until all of a sudden it gets sort of a growth spurt, like with low vitamin D in winter or spring or fall, and then shoots up. So, I mean, I guess, yeah, it turns out that keeping one's vitamin D levels higher from middle age on would help greatly in reducing risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. Now you asked about treatment. There is an interesting study on hypertension treatment. So it's a study in Canada involving people who were taking vitamin D, and many already had above 30 nanograms per milliliter. They were given a free bottles of vitamin D of 4,000 or 5,000 IU, and counseled on how to achieve greater than 40 nanograms per milliliter. And it turns out that for those who were hypertensive with blood pressure above 180 over 140, I believe, or 140, well, whatever it was, those who were hypertensive lost 12 to 18 millimeters of mercury blood pressure, and 3/4 of them became non-hypertensive at the end of the year, no matter whether they're on hypertensive drugs or not. So this is a very interesting study published in 2017, and it shows that you can treat hypertension with vitamin D. It turns out people who were not hypertensive did not reduce their blood pressure. It was just those who had very high blood pressure had the blood pressure drop down and were no longer hypertensive. Now, hypertension is one of the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So this is again means that there's a way to treat the precursors of cardiovascular disease.
Material you sent it talked about connection between vitamin D and dementia. Can you expand a little bit about that?
Yeah, that has been found. Or it seems that it's below 20 or 30 nanograms per milliliter that the rates of dementia and vitamin D increase. I'm not sure we know well, I don't know the mechanisms that well, but I think that inflammation is involved, and also vitamin D helps clear the brain of the amyloid plaque, which is sort of a hallmark of Alzheimer's. Vitamin D can also help improve sleep. There have been studies showing that getting up to 60 nanograms per milliliter can result in better sleep. And it turns out that it's during sleep that the brain clears a lot of the junk, like beta amyloid, and thereby, and sleep is known to be poor sleep is known to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So there's also the school of thought that dementia and Alzheimer's are related to cardiovascular disease and to diabetes. Well, certainly to diabetes, and again, vitamin D helps reduce the risk of both diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So I think there are a number of reasons why, number of mechanisms whereby vitamin D would reduce the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
So, but if I start take vitamin D when I have dementia, does like make sure that dementia goes away, or the like remnants of dementia still present if even though like you take vitamin D regularly, and how much big units we talk about?
I don't know about treating dementia, or I think if you start to get cognitive impairment, when you can't think straight, can't remember things, etc., I think that's when you want to start taking your vitamin D to help protect your brain, or earlier. But if you have dementia or Alzheimer's, you probably want to work with a physician or an alternative medicine person who can look at your blood chemistry and figure out what you need. And vitamin D is probably one of those, but I'm not sure how much effect it's going to have once you really have dementia or Alzheimer's.
If I have a signs of the like cognitive problems with thinking straight, that do I need to take like 5,000 units per day, or like 10,000 units per day, or the like continue what I using right now?
Well, how much do you take?
I take 10,000 units per day.
Okay, you look like you're pretty thin too. Have you had your vitamin D level measured?
No.
You might want to do that. And next time you go to your doctor, just ask for a vitamin D test. Like I say, the optimal level is around 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. There's one adverse effect of having very high vitamin D levels is that the risk of ordinary prostate cancer increases. And that's because the classic effect of vitamin D is to increase calcium and phosphorus uptake through the GI tract. Well, it turns out that phosphorus and or calcium are risk factors for prostate cancer. And so the higher your vitamin D level is, the greater the risk you have of this non-lethal prostate cancer. On the other hand, if you do get prostate cancer, it's more than having higher vitamin D levels will probably help fight it, but it's not going to be 100% effective. Now, also another problem with taking high dose vitamin D is that it can start putting more calcium in the vascular system, in the arteries. And so what's recommended is that if you're taking high dose vitamin D, also take vitamin K2. I get vitamin K2 from nanokinase. It's a soy product and has a lot of vitamin K2. It helps put the calcium in the bones and not in the arteries. And you also probably want to take magnesium, like 400 milligrams per day, and hold back on calcium supplements. I mean, if you take dairy products, that's fine for source of calcium, but you don't want to They found that taking over 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So there's some interactions with the various supplements that one has to be concerned about.
But that's like interesting thing you point out, that say that you have to pay attention what kind of supplements you're taking. That like I said, that if I take too much vitamin D, then I have to take vitamin K2 as well, because it puts the potassium back to your bones.
I take other supplements too to help the mitochondrial function, like alpha lipoic acid. I forget what other ones, but I take several more: zinc, selenium, NAC, N-acetylcysteine. I mean, you have to sort of look around to read the literature and find out what's beneficial for mitochondria and for antioxidants. Vitamin C, I take vitamin C. And
How much vitamin C you take?
I take 1 gram a day. If I get sick, I take a few grams a day.
I think I take the same amount of vitamin C, at 1 gram per day. I also had the interview with Thomas Levy, and he like point out that you have to like do your own research. That he like had one case that people came to talk with him, and he gave the book and she has, okay, what's in it? Read it. But I know what's in it, and pretty much in his mind, okay, sorry, I wrote the book, I did research, so it it will be much easier for you to like do the research. That one good idea I have gained so far is that do your own research. That there are so much limits of what we can do, and how much is there also a connection between disease like cancer, dementia, obesity, and what things you eat every day? Like you said, that US, lots of people eat processed meat. That make people sick, or there is something else?
Here's a book I'm very fond of, Metabolical by Robert Lustig. He's a San Francisco pediatrician who studied diabetes and metabolic disease among children. And he's written many papers on the role of fructose and sugar and processed food on the risk of things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And so I think much of the world's adverse health issues are linked to eating processed grains and processed food with too much sugar, too much simple grain. He points out that the processed foods, they digest very quickly, get into the blood, and then require insulin to come up and take care of it, and then you go crash and you have hypoglycemia. So and it says it's a major cause of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which many people, even if they're thin, can have by eating just a lot of processed foods. So I think he's on the right track in terms of diet to try to suggest eating whole foods, and others like T. Colin Campbell and Neil Barnard are stressing the eating whole plant-based diets. I must admit I eat some meat and fish and eggs, but I think that there's a lot of benefit to trying to go to a good plant-based diet, and whole plants with vegetables and fruits and grains and legumes and the like.
I think I have nothing more to ask because we think we have covered everything there is talked about. Dr. William, do you have anything to say for our viewers before we wrap things up?
Okay, well, I guess the only thing I can say is that for those who are interested in more vitamin D information, again, consider going to vitamindwiki.com, grassrootshealth.net, scholar.google.com, and my website, sunarc, sunarc.org, and you'll find my email address various places, and you can email me if you have any questions. Wish you all best of health, and hope that the vitamin D word gets promoted in Estonia and nearby countries.
Yeah, I hope so. Well. Dr. William Grant, thank you for coming, and have a nice day.
Thank you for inviting me, and best of health to you.